So we go on with our examples. Now, after taking a look at all sorts of tactical possibilities, taking a look at a relatively simple material, seeing what sort of motives could be at work, we proceed with something pretty pleasant. We switch to kingside attack. Basically, the pleasure of every chess player to use some tactics to sacrifice pieces to be able to mate the opponent's king. But of course, as we were mentioning before, there should be some positional aspects which could make the attack promising. We cannot start looking for sacrifices, looking for tactics just because we want to make some tactics work. We should acquire the notion, we could develop the feeling that tactics work when they should work. And why should they work? Because our pieces are more active, opponent's king is unsafe, and so on. So this work is pretty complex, and that's exactly what we are doing at the moment. So if we look at this position where I was white and I was to move, you will see that, in fact, white's pieces are very active. Rooks on the f file, queen on h5, bishop on c4 are all, in fact, attacking the f7 pawn, which is vulnerable almost by definition in chess. The pawn unprotected from the very beginning. So bishop, queen, and rooks. Seeing this, we should immediately see that the pawn on e6 thus also becomes vulnerable. And usually when we see something like this, our first impulse should be to check the immediate breakthrough. We check rook takes f7. And then after first slightly euphoric feeling, we see that in fact we do not threaten so much in this position. And he could go maybe g6, or maybe even something else. We calm down and we return, and we take a better look. And we see that in not only is f7 weak, in fact f7 is maybe even the better protected square of the three around black's king, because black even put his knight to h8 in order to achieve this. The other squares, in fact, could be attacked as well. How do we go about this? And now it is very important to remember that when we do not have checks, when there are no captures which bring us any results, of course, when calculating, the preference should be done to the moves which create some threats, which have very concrete ideas. That is why, for instance, in this position, we do not start looking at the move like king h1, for instance, as an example. We start with moves which create threats. We look at rook g3 because it puts a rook to a pretty active position against black's king. But does it create a threat? Well, queen h6 is one possibility. Using the fact that this pawn is pinned. But is it mate? No. Black will just play knight g6 and not much is going on. So rook g3 didn't even create a threat. Can we create a threat otherwise? Of course we can. We can play rook h3. Hitting h7, which would be just mate. What can black do? He will play h6. Nothing else he can do. And now we know that on the h file, if we manage to break through along the h file all the way to h7 or to h8, this will be mate. How can we do this? We know that basically we have to crush black at h6 or g7 to do this. Well, the ways to do it could be to bring some other pieces into play. Now, if we go rook f3, for instance, with an idea to go rook g3 and then take, this is very feasible. This strongly comes into consideration, but it is also certainly slow. And we thus start looking for a continuation which could be more forcing, more concrete. How can we at all attack the pawn on h6? This should be the question we ask ourselves. And once we ask the right question, the answer comes automatically. You want to attack the h6 pawns? Then why don't you do this? You go rook f6. And then check if it works. So asking the right questions helps also in chess, also in working on your tactical skills. You see, you come to f6, you threaten rook h6. The threat cannot be ignored, because if black does just something, I will just take on h6, take on h6, and then just mate on any of these two squares. So what to do? If he takes the rook, and that's exactly what I wanted. But you could say he can take a rook with a bishop, and he still has a pawn on g7. But then I take on f6, with check, and the king has nowhere to go, because I attack both these squares. He doesn't have any other squares. He takes g takes f6, queen takes h6, and this is mate. Well, we return to this position. We should imagine ourselves still in this position, calculating. Just because we did this, we should not just rush into things immediately. Just take a look. Can he somehow defend? Well, if we take a look, we say, okay, he cannot take on f6, he cannot ignore the threat, but he can try to block the way of the rook. And that's what Akel did in this game. And now we remember what we started with in the starting position. We were saying that all white's pieces are in fact aiming at the squares f7 and e6. And just because we made some moves, it is not necessary, or in fact one should not forget about the motives which were there from the very beginning. So when we are thinking in this position, we remember that in fact these were white squares where we wanted to break through from the very first, and we start looking at rook takes f7. We see that rook takes f7, bishop e6 is very dangerous for black, but maybe not immediately losing. We see the possibility of queen takes g6, and we see it is very strong. Then we also see that after rook f7, king takes f7 is possible, although white also has some options here, for instance queen f5 check, using the fact that this pawn is pinned, and then taking on e6 or on g6. And having done all this, we wonder, can't we keep it simpler? Can't we make it in such a way as to allow fewer lines? And then we see that in fact we can take on g6. And now of course he has no choice. He takes on g6 and you take. And in fact white threatens him. Rook h6, white threatens bishop e6, and it is just mate. Whatever black now does, I don't even know what move comes into consideration. For instance, king h8, then you do it this way, rook h6, g takes h6, queen h6, king g8, bishop e6 check. So you see, finally the position, the motive we started with from the very beginning, breaking through on e6, and f7 became possible through using tactical means. Rook f7, now you give check, then you pick up the rook and just deliver mate afterwards, or get a completely winning position. And in fact, not keen to see all this, Akel resigned after queen g6. So we once again return to the starting position and we take stock of what we did. We saw a weakness in black's camp. We found another weakness. We switched to this weakness, found yet another idea, and then, having weakened black's position considerably. We returned to the first idea we had. And thus, tactical means, like rook h3, rook f6, they helped to execute the positional idea we had from the very start. And that's exactly how it should be. So we continue with our work and get on with our example.